Okay, I hope I'm audible to all students who are attending this lecture of Development Economics, Part 1. We continue with our lectures on economic development. This is Chapter 2 of the book I prefer to follow for my lectures on economic development, which is Debraj Ray. Okay, now all students can recall that in the previous lecture we were looking at the reasons for disparities between the rich and the poor nations. We had done this particular topic in the previous lecture. We had done 3 important points in the previous lecture for large disparities between the per capita income in the rich and the poorer nations. So now in this particular lecture, we intend to look at the historical experiences. So students can open up your readings and we can mark and understand this. We look at historical experiences. Now, I'm not going into the depth of every paragraph because from examination point of view, you just need to read it, but you don't need to learn up. When it comes to learning up, you only need to learn up the content I will be making you mark. Okay, so if I scroll down, okay, if I scroll down, first of all students should know this mobility matrix. You should know how it works. Okay, so this is the income mobility matrix. And let's understand this. So you can see that if I just directly come to this, you can see that to understand how the mobility matrix works, let's start by converting all the per capita incomes or to fractions of the world's per capita income. That means the per capita income, to facilitate a comparison, we are converting the per capita income of every economy to the world's per capita income. So if country X has a per capita income of $1,000 and suppose the world average is $2,000, then we say that country X will have an index of half. That means $1,000 is country X's per capita income divided by the world's per capita income is 2,000. When I divide them, I get the index as half. So in similar ways, what the mobility matrix does is the mobility matrix creates categories that we will put each country into. These categories are like, let's say, if I talk about QA has created the following categories: 1/4, 1/2, 1, 2, and infinity. So when I talk about a category with a label 2, a category whose index is 2 contains all those countries with index between 1 and 2. A category 1/4 will contain all countries with indexes less than 1/4. A category infinity contains all countries with indexes exceeding 2 and lying between 2 and infinity. So we are looking at this mobility matrix to understand how countries have performed in terms of their per capita income. And in order to build this mobility matrix, what we do is, first of all, we convert the per capita incomes to fractions of the world's per capita income. So for every country, I am dividing the per capita income of that country with the world's per capita income. And then using that, we can create standard categories as given by QA: 1/4, 1/2, 1, 2, and infinity. I talk about any category. Suppose I talk about category 1. Category 1 is going to consist of all those countries whose per capita income lies between half and 1. Category 2 will consist of all those countries whose per capita income lies between 1 and 2. And so on. Okay. So suppose what we are doing now is we are doing this exercise. Imagine doing this exercise for 2 points in time. So time is also a dimension here. We are comparing over time. So with a view to finding out if a country transited from one category to another during this period. This is called a mobility matrix. So a mobility matrix is going to capture that over a period of time, from one point of time to another, has a country changed or transited from one category to another, where the categories are 1 by 4, 1 by 2, 1 to 1 infinity. So look at this mobility matrix diagram. Now, if I ask you, how do I interpret 26? So I can say that 26% of the countries have transited from the index of 1 to the index of 2. That means that if you look at this matrix is for 23-year period from 1962 to 1984. That means this is the indices for 1962, and these are the indices for 1984. And we are going to see that over this 23-year period from 1962 to 1984, how have the countries fared when it comes to comparing with the world average. So if I interpret 26, you can see that the reading has done that. You can see that if I interpret the entry 26 in the mobility matrix, it tells me that 26% of the countries who were between half the world average and the world average in 1962, you can see that it takes the value 1 in 1962. That means they were, if I take the value 1, it means that the per capita income of that country was lying between half and 1 of the world average. Have now transited to the index 2. It means now in 1984, the per capita income lies between 1 and 2 of the world average. So you can look at this. 26% of the countries who were between half the world average and the world average with the index 1 transited to being between the world average and twice the world average, which is index 2. So a matrix constructed in this way gives you a fairly good sense of how much mobility there is in the relative per capita GNP across the nations. Okay, so on the other hand, if you look at the diagonal, what does the diagonal indicate? The diagonal of the matrix indicates that there has been no mobility. 76% of the countries whose per capita income was less than 1 by 4 of the world average in 1962, they still have the same situation in 1984. 31% of the countries whose per capita income was between 1 by 4 and 1/2 of the world average still have the same situation in 1984. That means if I say that the elements on the diagonal of the mobility matrix are high, if these elements are large, it means there is low mobility. So you can see that a matrix with very high numbers on the main diagonal consists of those special cells with the same row and column categories. All of us know that when you are on the diagonal of the matrix, you are in the same row and same column. So that indicates low mobility. So according to such a matrix, countries that start off in a particular category continue to remain in that category in the next period also. Okay, so I can just write it here that if the diagonal of the mobility matrix consists of large numbers, it means that there is low mobility. It means that there is low mobility. If the diagonal of the mobility matrix consists of large numbers, we can say that there is low mobility. Okay, so hoping students have understood this. Similarly, guys, I can do one more interpretation for you. Let's talk about 7. How will I interpret 7 in the mobility matrix? It means that 7% of the countries whose per capita income was between 1 by 4th and 1/2 of the world average now are moving to the world average and twice the world average. Similarly, if I interpret 9, it means 9% of the countries whose per capita income was between half the world average and the world average now have the per capita incomes less than 1/4 of the world average. Okay, so hoping all students have understood this. This was the mobility matrix and a short note on it. So maybe you can just learn up some basic characteristics you know about the mobility matrix. You should know how to interpret the elements of the mobility matrix. But from examination point of view, you don't need to learn this matrix. No need to learn the elements of the matrix. You should know what the matrix denotes. You should know what the mobility matrix denotes. And you should know how to interpret the elements of the mobility matrix and the result. But you don't need to learn up the numbers like 76, 1, 12, 12, 0. You don't need to learn the elements from examination point of view. But you should definitely know what is meant by a mobility matrix and what does the entry in a mobility matrix denote and what does the diagonal denote. Now I am directly jumping to the important observations as a part of historical experience. So when you scroll down, you will see a summary. Now this summary is nothing but a summary of all the points, but I will request all students to learn these points. Very important. This is going to capture the historical experiences. So important, I can write important observations from 1960 to 1985, which sum up the historical experiences. Important observations from 1960 to 1985, which sum up the historical experience. Point number 1. Over the period 1960 to 1985, the relative distribution of the world's income appears to be quite stable. That means that over the period 1960 to 1985, empirically, we have not witnessed inequality in the distribution of world income. The distribution has been quite stable. It has not been changing. Let me correct myself. I'm not talking about inequality. Actually, inequality is very high. The world appears to be polarized. What I'm trying to point out here, let me correct the statement I've made. What I'm trying to point out here is that there has not been much fluctuations in the distribution of world income over the period 1960 to 1985. The richest 5% of the world's nation averaged a level of per capita income that was 29 times the corresponding figure for the poorest 5%. That means the richest 5% of the nations have per capita incomes which are 29 times the per capita income of the poorest 5%. By any standards, this disparity is staggering. That means the inequality is very high. And especially so when we remember that we are talking about incomes that have been corrected for purchasing power parity. That means, guys, even after correcting for purchasing power parity, the world still appears to be polarized in the fact that if you look at the period from 1960 to 1985, the richest 5% of the world's nation has per capita income which is 29 times larger than the poorest 5%. So the disparity between the rich and the poor is staggering or increasing or too much. Okay. This was point 1. Coming to point 2. The fact that the overall distribution has remained stationary does not mean that there has been little movement of the countries within the world distribution. Okay. So in 1980s is the rise of East Asian economies and the languishing of other economies, particularly those of Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. Diverse growth experiences such as these can change the economic composition of the world. in the space of a few decades. Okay, so this point is telling us that even though the world distribution has remained stable, the overall distribution of income has remained stable, but there has been a significant movement of countries if you look at the mobility matrix. So, hoping students have understood this. And then let's look at point number 3. The observation that several countries have changed relative positions suggests that there is no ultimate traps to development. At the same time, a history of wealth or poverty does seem to partly foretell the future developments. The mobility of countries appears to be highest somewhere in the middle of the wealth distribution, whereas a history of underdevelopment or extreme poverty appears to put the countries at a disadvantage. So point 3 is also further talking about the mobility matrix performance. And what we learn is that history of that particular country matters a lot when it comes to talking about the future development. A country which is born poor or endowed poor is put at a disadvantage when it comes to development. That means a country with poor endowments or a country which is starting off poor is not very able to change its index in the mobility matrix. It continues to remain in the same category. However, the mobility of the countries has been witnessed more in the middle of the wealth distribution. That means those countries who are in the middle, of the wealth distribution are seeing a greater mobility. That they are transforming into a higher index. But those countries which start off very poor continue to remain poor. Those countries which start off rich continue to remain rich, but those countries who are in the middle tend to become richer. That means they witness a higher mobility. So hoping students have understood point number 3. If I repeat point number 3, those countries which start off very poor continue to remain poor. That means there is very less mobility. Those countries which start off rich continue to remain rich, again less mobility. Higher level of mobility is witnessed for those countries who were in the middle of the wealth distribution. They were seen transforming into higher indices. Okay, so, and the fourth point, history matters in this phase, an observation that requires a careful explanation. Poor countries do also seem to have some advantages. They can use relatively free of charge technologies that are developed by their richer counterparts. Scarce capital in these countries should display a higher rate of profit because of the law of diminishing returns. All of us know it from microeconomics theory. Any resource which is scarce is going to have higher returns. So the poorer economies can learn from the mistakes that their predecessors have made. In this way, the differences across countries should iron themselves over the long run. So the last point is slightly optimistic about the fact that even if the poor countries are starting off with a very bad background in terms of per capita incomes, still there is some bright light or there is some hope that they can catch up in the long run. Why? Because the poor countries have some advantages in the form of higher returns on the scarce capitals, wise use of technologies developed by the richer countries. So the poor countries can learn from the mistakes which their predecessors have made or their governments have made in the past. These poor countries can make use of the technology of the richer countries free of charge because technologies have already been developed by the richer economies. The poor economies just have to make use of them. Poor countries don't have to develop anything from their own or from scratch. Poor countries only have to use the technologies developed by the richer economies. And since poor countries have scarce capital, obviously they are going to display a high rate of profits because scarce commodity tends to have higher returns. So all these facts in the fourth paragraph give a hope that even though poor economies start from a poor historical background, they can still make wise use of technologies and scarce capital to improve themselves over the long run. So all students who are attending this lecture should learn up these 4 points, which summarize the historical experiences between 1960 and 1985. Okay, these 4 points are important from examination point of view. You must learn up these 4 points. Okay, so this is where I intend to stop in this particular lecture. It was a short lecture where we had done the mobility matrix and we have looked at some important observations which sum up the historical experiences from 1960 to 85. Now, in the next lecture, we'll talk about income distribution, particularly in the developing countries. I'll start taking up discussion from this particular topic in the next lecture. So I hope all students have enjoyed this lecture. Any doubt, you can unmute your mic and ask, or you can call up or mail me your doubts at divineschoolofeconomics@gmail.com. This is where I stop in this lecture.